Last year, as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I convened a bipartisan hearing on carjacking. It was the first ever Judiciary Committee hearing on the subject. We heard from experts in law enforcement and the automobile industry. And since then, I've been working with Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, on a bill that we're going to introduce soon on the subject. The senator from Arkansas is a member of the Judiciary Committee. He did not attend our hearing, and he's never raised this issue with me. In fact, he introduced the bill we're considering at this moment yesterday. Why now? Well, he's very open in what he said on the floor and what he said in his press release. Later this afternoon, there'll be a vote on the DC Criminal Code. One of the issues is carjacking. He's trying to hitch a ride on this train in terms of the discussion of the penalties for crime. It's no coincidence. Senator Cotton has brought this bill to the floor because today we are voting on that resolution. The opponents of the resolution have focused on the bill's new sentence for carjacking, reducing the penalty from 40 years to 24, and ignored the fact that the resolution increases sentences for a host of other violent offenses and goes after crime guns, the source of gun crimes in many cities, including Washington and those I represent. Don't take my word for it. The senator's own press release explicitly links his new bill to today's vote. The senator knows this bill is not going to pass today. He wants a Democrat to object so he can falsely claim we don't care about carjacking. The reality is that the senator's bill would not help prevent carjacking, and it would make our federal prisons less safe. Let me explain. The senator from Arkansas's bill is called No Early Release for Carjackers Act. Catchy title, but it fails to recognize one basic fact. Carjackers cannot get early release from the federal system. Like every other federal sentence that's measured in years, carjacking sentences have a full-term release date and a good conduct release date. If you go to federal prison, you earn 54 days a year of good conduct credit if you follow the rules. If you break the rules, they take away your good conduct time. That has been the standard in the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, which abolished federal parole. Every federal judge knows about good conduct time when they impose a sentence. Earning good conduct time isn't getting released early, it's getting released when you're really expected to, so long as you behave and follow the rules. I've made it a point of visiting prisons regularly as a member of Congress and a member of the United States Senate. I commend it to all of my colleagues. We spend a lot of time talking about criminal sentencing and criminals themselves, and very little time actually visiting prisons to see what life is like behind bars. It's an educational experience. And I can tell you one thing you'll come to realize right off the bat. It is a dangerous place. The men and women who are corrections officers in the federal system literally risk their lives every single day to keep those incarcerated who've been sentenced by the courts. They ask us for very little, enough people to do the job right, safety in the workplace, and those few incentives that make it possible for them to have a decent day at work and go home alive at the end of the day. One of those things is good conduct. If they can incentivize prisoners not to beat up other prisoners or the corrections officers themselves with the promise of good conduct reductions in their sentences, that's a very important thing to do. We want these men and women, these law enforcement professionals, to have respect and to also have the law on their side. There are no federal offenses that disqualify you from good conduct time, not a single one, and for good reason. Good conduct time is an incentive to follow the rules in prison. That's what we want people who've broken the law to do while they're in prison. Learn to follow the rules. The threat of losing good conduct time is also a deterrent against breaking the rules. That helps prevent violence in prison, protects correction officers, and it protects the other incarcerated people. Good conduct time is a critical tool for federal prison officials to maintain order. That's why we don't disqualify anyone from good conduct time based on their offense of conviction. This bill would be the very first time in history. We've never done it before, and we shouldn't start now. Now this is not the first time that the senator has opposed efforts to rehabilitate prisoners. The reason he's trying to dismantle good conduct credit is because carjackers are already excluded from an important rehab program created by the First Step Act. He comes to the floor regularly to criticize the First Step Act, which he didn't support, and it's his right not to. He fails to mention two things. It was a bipartisan measure introduced by the primary sponsor at the time of Senator Grassley and myself and Senator Lee. It was signed into law by President Donald Trump. Soft on crime? This bill passed by an overwhelming vote of 87-12 in the Senate. Signed into law by President Trump. Unlike most Republican senators, Senator Cotton opposed the First Step Act. The First Step Act established earned time credits that allow prisoners to earn time off their sentences in exchange for completing programs that help reduce the likelihood they'll commit a new crime after they're released. The bill included a compromise that excluded from the program individuals who had committed any of dozens of offenses. Carjacking was one of those offenses. So the criticism he's making of the First Step Act doesn't apply to the argument he made on the floor. No matter how many recidivism-reducing programs a carjacker completes, no matter how many classes he takes or how many skills he learns, he cannot earn a day off his sentence under the First Step Act. Exactly the opposite of what the senator from Arkansas just said. That compromise wasn't enough for the junior senator from Arkansas. He offered an amendment to the First Step Act that would have excluded tens of thousands of low-level offenders from earned time credits. And I stood here on the Senate floor to oppose that amendment because I knew then, and I know now, the purpose of a recidivism reduction program is to reduce recidivism. Almost everyone in the Federal Bureau of Prisons will get out one day, and when we exclude people from these programs, we do not facilitate successful reentry, and we do not reduce recidivism. Now let's talk about what we can do to reduce carjacking. I've been working for months on a bill with Senator Grassley, Republican from Iowa, as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Our Combating Carjacking Act is based on recommendations from the experts who came to our hearing last year. I've discussed one key provision many times with the Sheriff of Cook County, Tom Dart, and here's what it does. Almost any car manufactured today has some kind of vehicle location system built into it. It's a device that automatically calls for help if you've been in an accident. This system is a great way to locate cars right away, in real time, after they've been carjacked. And that should be a huge deterrent to carjacking. If you take a car by threat or violence, law enforcement should be able to find you right away, take back the car, and put you under arrest for your crime. But right now, law enforcement has a hard time getting auto manufacturers to provide that location data, even when the victim, the vehicle owner, is standing there saying, "Please help the police find the person who just stole my car." Why? Some manufacturers are better than others about this, but they tell us they're worried about violating the Federal Driver Privacy Act, and they're worried about liability. So the bill we're working on carjacking creates an exception to the Driver Privacy Act. It says, if a car manufacturer gets a reasonable, good faith request from law enforcement for vehicle location data after a carjacking, they can provide that location data without liability. Because we want to make carjacking a crime that never pays off, and it won't if carjacked vehicles can be immediately tracked and recovered. That's why we're pursuing this. As I said before, I agree with Senator Cotton, carjacking is a serious problem that needs local and federal solutions. I invite him to join me and Senator Grassley in our bipartisan effort. I don't agree that wiping out good conduct credit for federal prisoners is the way to do it. Madam President, I object.
The objection is heard.
Well, Madam President, I'm disappointed that our bipartisan bonhomie this week about carjacking only lasted as long as overturning Washington, D.C.'s law. We should address how we can stop more carjacking. I don't think we should blame cars for carjacking the way some would blame guns for gun violence. The simplest way to stop carjacking is to lock carjackers away in prison for a long time and not to let them out early. And the senator from Illinois, I have to say, is right. I was the most implacable foe of the First Step Act, and I remain so. Guilty as charged. I'll walk free, like most violent criminals in Washington, D.C., who plead guilty as well, to continue my advocacy against that law, which has led to hundreds and hundreds of its beneficiaries committing violent crimes. It was a mistake in 2018 when we passed it. 87 senators committed a mistake, including most Republicans. President Trump made a mistake in supporting the First Step. Step Act. That law is dangerous to public safety. I yield the floor.
The senator from Maryland.
Thank you.
It's a lot these days about ending the Iraq War. Let's pause for a moment to remember the first time they ended the Iraq War. President Obama pulled American troops out of Iraq just over a decade ago. The dumb war, as Obama called it, was finally over. Except it wasn't. Turns out those American troops had kept a lid on a lot of chaos. When they left, the bad guys came back with a vengeance. President Obama dismissed ISIS as the JV team of the terrorist world. But even he couldn't turn a blind eye when ISIS seized Fallujah just 2 years after our troops left Iraq, then Mosul a few months later, and then threatened to bring all of Iraq into their so-called caliphate. So ultimately, President Obama, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and great ender of the Iraq War, had to start a new Iraq War not even 3 years after he had bugged out. Though actually it was an Iraq-Syria war. Obama's retreat backfired so badly that he had to deploy our troops to 2 countries this time, not 1. And guess which use of force resolution President Obama cited to fight ISIS? The same one that President Trump relied on in 2020 to kill Iran's terrorist mastermind, Qasem Soleimani, which is the same resolution that Democrats want to repeal today. All of which goes to show that this debate is not about Saddam Hussein. It's about whether the president, whether any president, should have maximum authority to pursue America's enemies in Iraq and Syria. Now, the Democrats have argued that the 2002 resolution wasn't necessary to stop ISIS because the 2001 War on Terror use of force resolution also applied. That's true. But apparently, President Obama didn't think the 2001 resolution was sufficient, since he also invoked the 2002 resolution. I would welcome any Democrat to explain why the leader of their party was wrong. Somewhat to my amusement, some Democrats and a few Republicans have contended not to worry. The president can always rely on his commander-in-chief authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to order military operations like the Soleimani strike. I agree. Yet these are the very same senators who usually argue that Article 2 authorizes only the most immediate and modest actions in self-defense. Everything else, they say, takes congressional approval. I'll be curious to hear from them the next time a president relies primarily on his Article 2 authority to take necessary action to defend America. But enough with debating how many JAG lawyers can dance on the head of a pin. Let's ask a more important question. In the real world, will repealing these resolutions make America more safe or less safe? To which I answer, just look around the region. Iran's proxies are trying to kill Americans every day, and that's hardly an exaggeration. Just last week, a suicide drone made by Iran killed an American contractor and wounded 6 other Americans in Syria. An Iranian rocket attack wounded another American after that. Meanwhile, ISIS still carries out dozens of massacres and suicide bombings every year. And that's not to mention new terrorist groups who may be waiting in the wings, ready for their shot at the title as America retreats. If we repeal these resolutions, will it make America more safe or less safe? The answer to that question is obvious. Threats still originate in and emanate from Iraq, whether terrorist groups like ISIS or Iran's proxies. We should not lightly throw away additional authorities to target them. Furthermore, we shouldn't give Joe Biden any more reason to avoid taking necessary action to protect America. President Biden is already in full flight from the Middle East. It was President Biden who ended the war in Afghanistan, just like President Obama ended the Iraq War. Now, the Taliban rules in Kabul, harboring terrorists who threaten our country. Iran killed an American last week because Joe Biden never acts until Iran kills an American. Since he became president, Iran has attacked American positions at least 83 times. Yet President Biden has only retaliated 4 times. Little wonder the Ayatollahs think they can get away with it, as they have with that latest strike. Because after we finally hit back last week, Iran struck our positions again, injuring yet another American. Yet Joe Biden, as of this moment, has not retaliated. A couple months ago, the administration also cited obscure legalistic grounds for why President Biden didn't shoot down a Chinese spy balloon over the Aleutian Islands. The last thing this president needs is more encouragement from Congress to turn the other cheek. Besides the message to the president, we should also consider the signal we send to our friends and enemies in the Middle East. President Biden has made matters worse through his shabby treatment of America's best friends. He has attacked the Netanyahu government over its domestic policies and funded its political opponents. He's attacked Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and promised to turn the kingdom into a pariah state. If we send the message that we're abandoning our friends, we shouldn't be surprised if they begin to hedge their bets. Already, our allies are doing just that, turning to China as a new power broker. Just this month, Beijing brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's encouraged the Saudis to trade oil in Chinese currency instead of dollars. China's also undertaken to build a secret port in the United Arab Emirates. The trend is unmistakable. China looks like a rising power in the region, while America appears to be on the decline and on the way out. We can reinforce that impression today or not. Democrats can say that's not the message they intend, but what matters more is what our friends and foes hear. We'll vote on it soon. It's not just China that's exploiting our weaknesses. Iran sees our retreat as a green light to dominate Iraq. Already, it's manipulating Iraq's politics and arming Shia militias. Iran just signed a border deal with Iraq to send even more arms and cash to its proxies. Tehran's influence will only grow if ours recedes. We'll vote on that soon, too. In short, repealing these resolutions will embolden terrorists, embolden Iran, and embolden China, while demoralizing our allies and making it harder to punish attacks on Americans. Do senators really want to sign up for these consequences? When another ISIS rears its head, or Iran's proxies use Iraq's territory for safe haven, do senators really want to be responsible for stripping our troops of these additional legal authorities? I don't, and I won't. But if they do, let them say so plainly. Let them say that this academic exercise, which even they admit won't legally constrain any president, is worth these deadly, real-world consequences. Our men and women deserve that honest debate. After all, it's their lives depending on it. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, after weeks of negotiating with an obstinate and capricious president, the House of Representatives passed legislation yesterday raising the debt ceiling and establishing budget caps for the next 2 years. Both Democrats and Republicans compromised in these negotiations, and like every piece of compromise legislation, there are good parts and bad parts of this bill. I want to commend Speaker McCarthy for a number of common sense victories. This bill improves the environmental review process for infrastructure projects. It cuts funding for President Biden's army of IRS agents and saves American taxpayers tens of billions of dollars by clawing back unused COVID funds. Now, the bill doesn't go as far as I might like. It reduces domestic spending to last year's levels, which is better than even more spending and taxes, as the Democrats proposed. But I think domestic spending could return to pre-pandemic levels. COVID emergency legislation was just that, an emergency, compelled by Chinese communist lies. Shouldn't reset the federal government's budget in perpetuity. But again, I sympathize with the Speaker's constraints of a small House majority and negotiating with the Democratic Party that seems to prioritize welfare for grown men who won't work over our military. And as I noted, there are some victories in this bill, and it prevents a default. Unfortunately, this bill poses a mortal risk to our national security by cutting our defense budget, which I cannot support, as grave dangers gather on the horizon. The bill's supporters contend that it raises defense spending by 3.2% compared to last year, and that's true at face value. But inflation was 6% last year. When you get a 3% raise, but prices go up by 6%, even a small child could tell you that your money won't go as far, and your family will have to tighten its belt. And it gets worse next year, when the defense budget will grow by only 1%. Who thinks Joe Biden will get inflation to pre-pandemic levels? And even if he did, inflation would grow at least twice as fast as the defense budget, causing even more real cuts to defense. Worst of all, this bill contains an automatic 1% sequester based off last year's budget. That means that domestic spending will go up and defense spending will go down if the sequester kicks in. Let me repeat that. If the sequester takes effect, Democrats will get more welfare spending while defense gets cut. Who thinks the Democratic leader will be dissatisfied with this result? More to the point, who thinks he won't use the threat of sequester to extort even higher levels of welfare spending? These three provisions, a cut this year in real dollars, a worse cut in real dollars for 2025, and the automatic sequester based on last year's spending bills, conspire to threaten devastating cuts to the defense budget at a time we can least afford it. The bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission report recommends a real increase to defense spending of between 3% and 5% annually over inflation. This bill would cut real spending by more than 5% in 2 years, effectively slashing tens of billions of dollars from defense. How bad is this defense gap? If we continued our recent bipartisan custom of increasing the defense budget from President Biden's irresponsible budget proposals, we could afford 4 additional Ford-class aircraft carriers, 500 F-35 fighter jets, more than 91,000 Stinger missiles, or 500,000 Javelin anti-tank missiles, all vital to our defense and to the defenses of Ukraine and Taiwan. And while we surrender our lead and erode our military edge, our enemies are catching up. Last year, Russia increased its real military spending over inflation by 1%. China increased its real spending by over 6%, and Iran increased its real spending by over 8%. The United States reduced our real spending by over 3%. And this bill, as I've said, would only make matters worse. For years, Washington has gotten defense spending backwards. The budget shouldn't shape our defense needs. Indeed, it cannot shape our defense needs. Our defense needs have to shape our budget. China doesn't become less aggressive, or Russia less revanchist, or Iran less extreme because our military has shrunk. In fact, the opposite is true. They grow more ambitious and dangerous. The defense budget should rise and fall with the dangers confronting our nation, and I do not believe those dangers are receding. Who here believes the world is safer or more stable than it was a year ago or 2 years ago? On the contrary, America is in greater danger than at any time in my life. Iran is rushing towards a nuclear bomb. Russia has unleashed the largest European invasion since the Second World War. And China is plotting the conquest of Taiwan. Our military stockpiles are depleted, and our defense supply chains are broken or strained. At the same time, our border defenses have effectively collapsed, and cartel members, criminal aliens, possibly even terrorists are pouring into our country. We need a military to match this perilous moment. After all, protecting the safety and security of our people is our first and most fundamental responsibility. We cannot shortchange the military today without grave risks tomorrow. The weapons we buy this year will be the ones we field in 2027, the time by which China will be at its greatest relative strength compared with the United States, and when war is most likely. I know that holding firm on defense priorities isn't always easy, and as I said, there are parts of this bill that I support, but I cannot support the bill because it does not adequately fund our military given the threats we face. Supporters of the bill contend that the situation isn't as bad as I make it out to be, but their arguments don't hold up under scrutiny. Some have claimed that we could still get more defense funding through a supplemental bill or some other backdoor funding mechanism, but these same hollow promises were made when Congress passed the Budget Control Act of 2011, which devastated our military under President Obama. I ran for the Senate in part to reverse that disaster, and I won't vote for a new disaster with the same promises. And as I've explained, the sequester in this bill actually produces more domestic spending than the bill's core provisions, which encourages irresponsible Democrats to trigger sequester. Others have claimed that we can find efficiencies in the Pentagon to make up the difference. I don't disagree that there's fat to trim in some places in our military, but no serious person thinks that it's enough to make up for tens of billions of dollars in cuts. Moreover, this claim assumes the Biden administration will put our readiness ahead of social engineering. Color me skeptical on that one when they start looking for efficiencies. Still, other supporters have shrugged and deployed the commonly used but rarely persuasive argument that the bill may be bad, but there's no alternative, and it's too late anyway. But it was and it remains our job to craft an alternative. We hear a lot that things that add votes to these big bills get in, and things that subtract votes don't. Again, we know from recent experience with the last two National Defense Authorization Acts that a higher defense number gets nearly 400 votes in the House and more than 80 votes in the Senate. The first thing that should have been settled in these negotiations was a larger defense budget. Democrats have no argument against that recent history. It's indisputable that increases to Joe Biden's defense budgets garner large bipartisan majorities in the House and the Senate. So why wasn't it the first thing settled? I don't know. But the result is that a Congress with a Republican House and a Democratic Senate has now produced a defense budget worse in real terms than either defense budget produced by a unified Democratic Congress. I cannot vote for that curious result. And if it takes a short-term increase in the debt ceiling to go back to the drawing board, so be it. Before we vote, I would also ask all my fellow senators a simple question. Do you feel more safe or less safe than you did a year ago? If you feel more safe, by all means, vote to slash our defense budget. But if not, and in your heart of hearts you know you don't, join me in demanding that we do what it takes to protect our nation. I yield the floor. Madam President, I call up my Amendment 106 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, proposes an amendment numbered 106.
Colleagues, this bill has budget caps for domestic and defense spending. I don't like the defense number in this year. I like it even less next year. That's why I'm opposing it. But it also has a much worse provision. It has a 1% automatic reduction. That is based on last year's omnibus, not the caps on this bill. Let me restate that. Last year's omnibus, not this bill. So if we go to a continuing resolution on October 1, which we almost always do, domestic spending will go up by $61 billion, while defense goes down by $27 billion. Not the caps in this bill. If the sequester of 1% kicks in, domestic spending will go up by $61 billion, and defense will go down by $37 billion. Progressives will get more welfare for grown men who refuse to work while defense is slashed. Think about the incentives this gives to the Democratic leader when it comes to appropriations bills. I ask for a simple change in this amendment. The caps or the sequester should be based on the caps that you're about to agree to, not last year's spending bill. I yield the floor.
Senator from Washington
Madam
is
President,
recognized.
I rise in opposition to the senator's amendment. Our defense spending is critical, but so are our investments to combat fentanyl, rebuild American manufacturing, especially for things like chips, improve access to childcare, early learning, and a lot more. We cannot shortchange our investments in families and our country's future, and the underlying bill will already force painful cuts. This amendment would make it so the consequences of failing to pass our appropriations bills falls heavily on our non-defense programs, and that will hurt our families across the country. Let me be clear, we will not let that happen. None of us want to end up in a situation where we have a CR in the first place. That is exactly why I am committed to making sure we write the strongest 12 funding bills possible and get them passed in a timely way. This amendment would set us back even further and target the programs that are a lifeline for working people in this country. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second.
Today is the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Mogadishu. At this very moment, 30 years ago, nearly 100 Rangers and Delta Force operators were pinned down in the city, caring for the wounded and fighting off thousands of heavily armed Somali militiamen. Helicopter crews from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, provided aerial fire support. One of the most intense battles of modern times had been going for 7 hours. It would continue through the night for another 8 hours. In the end, 18 Americans died and more than 70 were wounded. This epic battle was immortalized in the classic book Black Hawk Down by Mark Bowden and dramatized in the movie of the same name. What most Americans know about the battle comes from his excellent reporting. What Bowden made clear is sometimes overlooked. These warriors accomplished their mission. The veterans of that battle should hold their heads high with pride, and the Gold Star families of those 18 fallen warriors in Mogadishu should know that their husbands, sons, and fathers were indeed heroes, no less than the men who jumped into Normandy or stormed Iwo Jima. Unfortunately, their leaders in Washington failed these heroes. No modern battle better reflects some enduring truths we ought to keep in mind today. We should only commit our forces when our vital national security interests are at stake, when the mission is so critical that it justifies American casualties if necessary. Once committed, we should provide our troops with every last thing they need to fight and win, without tying one hand behind their backs. And we should be mindful of what dangerous lessons we teach our enemies when we handcuff our troops or squander their battlefield victories. Let's go back to how those Rangers, Delta operators, and Night Stalkers wound up fighting for their lives in the streets of Mogadishu. In 1992, an estimated 350,000 Somalis had starved to death in a famine of biblical proportion. The American media highlighted the atrocious suffering in Somalia, but the famine primarily resulted not from natural disaster, but from rival warlords fighting a brutal civil war. The warlords stole food aid shipment to profiteer, feed their own clans, and starve their enemies. Hunger was just another weapon. After the election and with the approval of President-elect Clinton, President Bush decided to intervene. He acted against the counsel of many of his senior advisors. CIA Director and later Secretary of Defense Bob Gates summed up their opposition by observing that no vital American interest was at stake. Moreover, the humanitarian disaster was caused by the warlords, So intervening to ensure the safe delivery of food aid merely addressed the symptoms, not the causes of the famine. Gates lamented the first U.S. military intervention driven by CNN. In his diary, President Bush cited the shocking loss of life from the famine and the perception that America didn't do enough to help Black and Muslim nations as justification for intervention. Not exactly core national interests. Whatever one thinks of his decision, though, President Bush wisely used overwhelming force to pursue strictly defined and limited objectives. He deployed more than 25,000 troops to Mogadishu, but only to secure the port and distribute food aid to needy Somalis. He refused the United Nations proposal to expand the mission to disarming the Somali warlords. Faced with such overwhelming power, the warlords backed down and allowed the aid to flow freely into Mogadishu. Then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, later reflected that within weeks we were so successful that we had upset the economics of the marketplace. So much free food came pouring into Somalia that it became tough to make a living by farming. When Bill Clinton took office in January 1993, he inherited a successful, narrow mission that was drawing down. Unfortunately, he snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. He flipped President Bush's approach of overwhelming force with limited and defined objectives on its head. By March, President Clinton turned over primary responsibility to the UN, reduced the American presence to barely more than 4,000 troops, and expanded the mission to encompass the grandiose objective of nation building. Our UN ambassador, Madeleine Albright, proclaimed that we will embark on an unprecedented mission aimed at nothing less than the restoration of an entire country. Gates later called the plan a pipe dream and hopelessly unrealistic. Powell scoffed that since the catastrophe had been provoked by feuding 14th century style warlords, the solution was a dose of 20th century style democracy. What happened next was all too predictable. The warlords no longer feared the shrunken American force and renewed their fighting against each other and the UN peacekeepers. By June, the militia of the most powerful warlord, Mohammed Farah Aidid, massacred 24 Pakistani peacekeepers. 2 months later, Aidid's men killed 4 Americans and wounded another 4 in separate bombings. Faced with American casualties, the inexperienced president felt compelled to respond, but he only authorized half measures. He deployed 450 Rangers, Delta Force operators, and Night Stalkers to capture Aidid and destroy his command structure. Though these soldiers are among our nation's very best, the mission creep was extraordinary. President Clinton simply asked too much of too small a force. Mogadishu was a dense city of more than 1 million residents, including thousands of Aidid's Klansmen and fanatical supporters, some of whom probably received training from al-Qaeda operatives on how to shoot down our helicopters. Yet the elite forces immediately set themselves to the task of rolling up Aidid's network. Their mission on October 3rd was straightforward enough for these seasoned warriors. Intelligence reports placed key Aidid lieutenants in downtown Mogadishu. Rangers would fast rope from Blackhawks to the street at the corners of the target house to establish a security perimeter. Delta operators would hit the house and detain the targets. Meanwhile, a convoy of Rangers would stage nearby, ready to transport our troops and their prisoners back to the nearby American base. Helicopters would provide covering fire throughout the operation. All told, the mission was supposed to last only an hour. But this operation occurred deep in the territory of Aidid's clan, and the fighting was intense from the moment the helicopters hit the target house. Aidid's militiamen and angry mobs rushed to the scene, and the streets erupted in gunfire and explosions. The Rangers and Delta operators fought back ferociously, securing the house and beginning to set in the defensive perimeter. Then disaster struck. First, one Black Hawk was shot down, killing the pilots. A downed helicopter was a contingency for which the task force had planned, but it still greatly complicated the mission. Now, rather than returning to base with the prisoners, the Rangers and Delta operators first had to fight their way to the crash site, secure it, and recover the dead. And then another disaster struck. Militiamen shot down a second Black Hawk, a contingency for which the task force lacked sufficient search and rescue assets. Two Delta snipers, Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart, had been providing covering fire from another helicopter. Observing a mob rushing toward the downed helicopter, they repeatedly requested permission to be inserted to protect the crash site. Once on the ground and with nothing more than small arms, they heroically fought back the mob until they ran low on ammunition and were overwhelmed. The injured pilot, Mike Durant, narrowly escaped death and was instead taken prisoner. For their willingness to give their lives for his, in the face of impossible odds, Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Shugart posthumously received the Medal of Honor, the only medals of honor awarded between Vietnam and Afghanistan, to give you a sense of the intensity of the battle. Meanwhile, the Rangers and Delta operators had moved by foot to secure the first crash site and recover the remains of their fallen comrades. One pilot was trapped under tons of wreckage, complicating the recovery mission. But there was never any question that they would stay until they succeeded. Their creed permitted nothing else: leave no man behind. In any event, they had no way out because the supporting convoy was decimated in the maze of downtown Mogadishu, a rat's nest of alleys, flaming roadblocks, and enemy fire. Rendered combat ineffective, the convoy had to return to base, leaving the dismounted Rangers and Delta operators isolated at the crash site. Bloodied and staggered, they hunkered down and prepared for the long night ahead. With night stalkers heroically suppressing the Somalis from the sky, the Rangers and Delta operators defended their position, tended their casualties, and continued the efforts to recover the remains of their fallen comrades. Their commanders cobbled together a new and more heavily armed convoy from the nearby 10th Mountain Division and Pakistani and Malay UN peacekeepers. This convoy reached their position early in the morning of October 4th, as they still struggled to recover the pilot's body. Even the endgame was frightful for these warriors. Once they finally recovered the fallen and prepared to escape, nervous and poorly prepared foreign drivers sped away before all the American troops could load up, forcing several to run what became known as the Mogadishu Mile to a different rendezvous point. Miraculously, given all they had been through, they nonetheless made it down alive. It is hard to overstate the ferocity of the battle. Jeff Strucker was a young Ranger who received the Silver Star for his actions. Strucker had seen combat before Mogadishu and many times after. Years later, he said of that night, "Nothing came close to Mogadishu. I mean, not even close." I once heard the same from General Scott Miller, a legend of the special operations world and our last four-star commander in Afghanistan. He was a young Delta captain on the ground. He observed that, "I've seen a lot of firefights these last 20 years, but nothing close to Mogadishu." I've never spoken to a veteran of Mogadishu who said anything different. Against all odds and in spite of all the horror, these warriors, I want to stress again, accomplished their mission and returned bloodied but victorious. They captured their targets and they brought them out. Tragedy indeed struck, with 18 troops killed in action and more than 70 wounded. But our troops inflicted far, far more casualties. Even conservative estimates put enemy deaths over 500 and casualties over 1,000. As one Delta operator put it to Bowdoin, they just fought one of the most one-sided battles in American history. But the shocking videos of the bodies of American soldiers being desecrated, an American pilot in captivity, overshadowed everything else. Most Americans had no idea we even had troops in Somalia, much less that they were engaging in such ferocious battle. President Clinton had failed to articulate what vital national interest justified his decision to massively expand the limited mission he inherited from President Bush. He neither deployed enough troops nor gave them enough firepower and engagement authorities to complete that expanded mission. Now, faced with political controversy, he cut and ran. His decision left many of our troops in Mogadishu confused and enraged. Many asked, if the mission was worth 18 American lives, why would they abandon it now? And if it wasn't, what were they doing there in the first place? And what about vengeance for the dead and wounded? President Clinton didn't trouble himself to answer these questions. He shut down Task Force Ranger. He announced that the American forces within the broader UN peacekeeping mission would come home by March. He released the prisoners that Task Force Ranger had captured, including the 2 targets from the raid on October 3rd. President Clinton later wrote that I knew how President Kennedy felt after the Bay of Pigs. I suppose so. He knew what it felt like to bring humiliation and shame to a great and powerful nation. And grave danger. Because among the unanswered questions was another one. What kind of lesson would it teach our enemies if America packed up and left at the first moment of bloodshed? For it wasn't just Americans and Somalis watching. The rest of the world was also watching. Among those watching was the obscure leader of a nascent terrorist network called Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden concluded that America, in his words, was a paper tiger, and after a few blows, ran in defeat. In fact, bin Laden regularly cited President Clinton's frantic withdrawal from Somalia in his many fatwas, statements, and interviews about America over the next 8 years. A dangerous lesson is also an important reminder for us today. We can control where we commit our forces, which we shouldn't do absent a compelling national interest. We certainly shouldn't commit them to quixotic, Wilsonian nation-building projects. But once American power and prestige is committed, the whole world is watching, especially our enemies. And from Somalia to Kabul to Ukraine, they will learn dangerous lessons when our leaders are timid, irresolute, and weak. But one lesson our enemies will always take away from the Battle of Mogadishu is never challenge the American soldier on the field of battle. Against all odds and despite political constraints, our troops in Mogadishu fought with unparalleled bravery and skill. They brought back their dead and wounded. They accomplished their mission. They made their country proud. On behalf of the grateful nation, I want to thank the men who served and sacrificed so much 30 years ago. God bless them. God bless their families. May God continue to bless America with warriors just like them. Today marks the 40th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Grenada. This short and largely overlooked conflict is one of the most successful military interventions in history. In just 4 days, President Ronald Reagan toppled an anti-American regime, rolled back communism in the hemisphere, and saved American lives. In the years that followed, we built a strong, genuine, and enduring partnership with the people of Grenada. But this success was far from certain. It was only possible because of President Reagan's decisive and overwhelming military response to a crisis on the island. The seeds of this crisis were sown, like many others, during Jimmy Carter's disastrous presidency. Under President Carter, communism began to metastasize in Latin America. And in the especially pivotal year of 1979, both Nicaragua and Grenada fell to communists. As he returned from Managua, Fidel Castro boasted, "Now there are 3 of us." And the Cuban dictator had big plans to add more captive nations to his anti-American axis in the hemisphere. Grenada is a small island located in the southeast Caribbean and strategically vital to both Cuba and Soviet Russia during the Cold War. Barely 150 miles off the coast of Venezuela, the island could serve as an offshore arms depot for communist rebels in Latin America and other Caribbean nations. Russia could also use Grenada as a base to launch submarines into the Caribbean basin. Most concerning was Grenada's proximity to Africa, which made it the potential final link in a chain of communist air bases from southern Russia to North Africa to West Africa to Grenada and then finally to Cuba. Soviet bombers and heavy cargo planes could fly between these lily pad of bases for refueling and largely beyond American detection. This grave threat materialized when Grenada welcomed hundreds of Cubans to construct a massive airport with a 9,000-foot runway. What Ronald Reagan called a suspiciously huge runway was far larger than anything Grenada's commercial aviation required. It was, curiously enough, just big enough to support the largest Soviet bombers and cargo aircraft. This airbase posed a two-way threat. Russia could use Grenada as a launching pad in the hemisphere to arm Cuba and other Latin American communists. Going the other way, Castro could export revolutionaries to the bloody war in Angola and elsewhere in Africa. Tensions boiled over into crisis in October 1983, when an even more radical, bloodthirsty gang of communists toppled the ruling communists in Grenada. The new government killed the former prime minister and instituted a 24-hour shoot-on-sight curfew that threatened hundreds of American medical students on the island. The Reagan administration feared a replay of the Iranian hostage crisis, and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States pleaded with the administration to intervene and prevent communism from spreading further in the region. Within days, Reagan had concluded that we had no choice but to act strongly and decisively, as he put it, and he authorized an invasion. This wasn't an easy decision. We had only spotty intelligence on Grenada's forces and capabilities and the presence of Cuban or other communist forces. We had little time to execute the mission, and many in Washington still hesitated to use military force due to Vietnam syndrome. But Reagan was undaunted. Then a disaster halfway around the world threatened to derail the operation. Just after Reagan authorized the invasion planning, a suicide bomber killed 241 Marines in their Beirut barracks. Although heartbroken and enraged by the attack, Reagan didn't let the crisis in Lebanon crowd out the crisis in our backyard. He declared there are Americans there and they are in danger. We are going. This is an important point. Contrary to liberal smears, Reagan did not authorize the Grenada invasion as cover for his withdrawal from Lebanon or to flex his muscles after the Beirut bombing. He authorized the invasion planning before the bombing happened in Beirut. The historical record on this is absolutely clear. Unlike Democratic presidents, Reagan didn't act tough to conceal his true weakness. Reagan was tough on America's enemies and tough in defense of America's interests. On October 25th, barely a week after the coup, around 8,000 American troops embarked on Operation Urgent Fury. They had a clearly defined mission: save the endangered Americans, depose the communist regime, and reestablish order on the island. Our troops had some setbacks, but they adapted, overcame, and prevailed. The incomplete intelligence and short time frame for preparation hampered the operation, yet vindicated Reagan's judgment. Military leaders anticipated only 200 Cuban construction workers on the island. In reality, 700 well-armed Cuban soldiers awaited American forces. Our troops also discovered huge weapons caches at the air base, enough to arm the Cuban forces and thousands more communist rebels. Reagan had acted just in time. The war ended after 4 lopsided days. Our troops took fewer than 150 casualties, while the communists suffered nearly 500 casualties and more than 600 Cubans surrendered. Our citizens on the island were safe. Reagan hit hard, he hit fast, and America won. And Fidel Castro's dreams of hemispheric revolution soon turned to ash. Reagan destroyed communism in Grenada and besieged the communist regime in Nicaragua. A year after Reagan left office, Nicaragua ousted Daniel Ortega in a democratic election made possible by American pressure. The Grenada operation was the first successful military rollback of communism during the Cold War. We had eliminated a deadly threat on our doorstep, and we had liberated a grateful people who enjoy freedom and democracy to this day. Reagan worked to stabilize the island and later traveled there in 1986. Tens of thousands of Grenadians lined the streets and welcomed Reagan as a liberator. Grenada's prime minister described Reagan as our own national hero and our rescuer after God. Reagan passed banner after banner that read, "God bless America," and later wrote that, "I probably never felt better during my presidency than I did that day." What Reagan felt that day was the joy of American success, made possible by American strength and confidence. This success stands in stark contrast to other interventions like the one we saw in Somalia 10 years later under Bill Clinton. I spoke here 3 weeks ago to mark the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Mogadishu. While Reagan delivered a crushing and decisive blow against a regime that threatened America's interests, Bill Clinton used insufficient forces for an ill-defined, expansive mission in a nation where our interests weren't at stake. He then cut and ran after the first sign of resistance, emboldening our enemies, including Osama bin Laden. No 2 interventions were more different in rationale, execution, or result. And they offer important lessons for today. The most profound is that weak interventions with vague and self-righteous missions usually fail. Strong military action with well-defined missions focused on America's interests usually succeed. We must never confuse the United States Army for the Salvation Army. Our military is not a charitable organization, and it's not a tool of mankind. It is the most fundamental interest of our national power and ours alone. And it should be used to pursue American interests and American interests alone. It's not the military's responsibility to right every wrong in the world or to be an avenging angel of liberal democracy. One of America's great statesmen, John Quincy Adams, once wrote that America is the well-wisher to freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Indeed, he famously observed that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. I have to observe, though, that Adams wrote that we do not search for monsters to destroy. But the architect of the Monroe Doctrine and the chief defender of Andrew Jackson's conquest of Spanish Florida was no pacifist. When monsters rear their heads and challenge America, especially in her own hemisphere, America must indeed not hesitate to destroy those monsters. From Tripoli to Berlin to Tokyo to St. George's, we have done it before, and we must be prepared to do it again. And when we must go abroad to destroy monsters, we must use overwhelming force. If Washington is unwilling to use the force necessary to win, we ought not use force at all. It is unfair and cruel to both American troops pursuing the mission and to our friends in the nation where the mission is being conducted. As we look for examples to follow in this new moment of international crisis and chaos, we should look to Reagan, not to Clinton. We need more Grenadas and no more Somalias. On this 40th anniversary of the invasion of Grenada, I would also like to recognize and thank the veterans of that conflict, along with their families, for their invaluable service. They made our country proud and helped bring communism to its knees in this hemisphere. God bless them all, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you. 3 weeks ago, Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists murdered 33 Americans and 1,400 Israelis in the deadliest terrorist attack since September 11, 2001. These depraved savages killed more Jews in a single day than any time since the Holocaust. Israel is now at war and on the verge of what could be its bloodiest battle in a generation. In this struggle, Israel is not only fighting Hamas in Gaza, it's fighting a confederation of Iranian-trained, funded, and armed terrorist organizations. From the Houthis in Yemen to Hezbollah in Lebanon to Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, Iran is besieging Israel by proxy. At the same time, Iran is conducting extensive attacks against Americans in the region. Since Joe Biden took office, Iran and its proxies have attacked American forces more than 100 times. Let me say that again, 100 times. That's why we need a person of strength as the U.S. ambassador in Israel. We need an ambassador who's a champion of the American-Israeli relationship, who can bridge the democratic-driven divides in the alliance. We need an ambassador who is clear-eyed about the Iranian threat and prepared to confront it. Instead, President Biden has nominated Jack Lew, who at times seems a better friend to Tehran than Jerusalem. The United States Senate should reject this nomination to be ambassador to Israel. A vote for him is a vote to subvert, not strengthen, our ally in its time of need. As President Obama's Treasury Secretary, Jack Lew was a leading proponent of the disastrous Iran nuclear deal. The deal delivered more than $100 billion to the Ayatollahs. Mr. Lew called the agreement a strong deal and said, "It will make our country safer, it will make our allies safer, and it will make the world safer." He apparently didn't consult our allies, though, before making that statement, because our allies in Israel certainly didn't agree. In fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu called the agreement a very bad deal. And one poll found that 73% of Jewish Israelis believe that the deal posed an existential threat to the Jewish state. Prime Minister Netanyahu was so opposed to the Iran deal, which Mr. Lew championed, that he traveled to the United States and addressed a joint session of this Congress to urge our opposition. Mr. Lew condemned Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech as beyond the pale and a huge mistake. Apparently, Mr. Lew also did not consult our own Democratic leader, the senator from New York, who also voted against the disastrous Iran deal. Worse still, Mr. Lew stood with President Obama when he refused to veto a United Nations Security Council resolution condemning Israel. This was nothing but an act of spite by Barack Obama against Israel's leadership. Yet Mr. Lew stood by his boss, dismissively asserting that, "I don't think it's a great thing for Israel to always have only the United States standing between it and condemnation." So according to Mr. Lew, I guess it's better to have Israel condemned than to have Israel's back. Mr. Liu apparently doesn't understand that doing what's right is sometimes lonely business. The next American ambassador to Israel must be prepared for the hard and lonely work of sometimes standing up against the rest of the region and indeed the rest of the world in defense of American and Israeli interests. Mr. Liu's glib comments demonstrate that he lacks either the nerve or the will to stand up for Israel when it really matters and the chips are down as they are today. But Mr. Liu didn't just advocate on behalf of the Iran nuclear deal or attack its Israeli critics. He lied to Congress to protect the deal, indeed to go beyond what the nuclear deal required. Mr. Liu told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the summer of 2015 that Iran would, quote, continue to be denied access to the American financial and commercial market, end quote. Mr. Liu also testified that Iranian banks, quote, will continue to be denied access to the world's largest financial and commercial market. But 7 months later, in early 2016, Jack Liu's Treasury Department granted a license to convert almost $6 billion of Iranian assets into American currency using our financial system. This was not required by the Iran nuclear deal. This went over and above the dictates of that deal. But apparently Barack Obama and Jack Liu felt bad for the murderous Ayatollahs because they weren't getting enough economic benefit out of the deal. He even pressured 2 American banks to complete the transaction, and they sanely and patriotically said, no thanks, we don't want to touch Iran's blood money. That's not lying to Congress. I don't really know what is. But in addition to lying, Mr. Liu neglected to inform Congress that his department was sending its representatives around the world to encourage foreign countries and companies to do business with Iran. According to a Senate committee report authored by former Senator Robert Portman, the Treasury and State Department conducted more than 200 so-called road shows in foreign cities to encourage economic engagement with Tehran. Again, this is not required by the nuclear deal with Iran. Nothing said Jack Liu and his agents at Treasury had to act as the de facto investment bankers and business agents for the murderous Ayatollahs. He apparently felt so much sympathy for the Ayatollahs that he and John Kerry, as Secretary of State, would send their agents all around the world hustling up business for Iran's terror regime. And now this is the man who's going to represent American interests in Jerusalem? The Senate should not confirm Jack Liu, a man who has lied to Congress both by omission and overt dishonesty. The Senate should likewise not confirm a man who has acted as the de facto investment banker and business agent for the bloodthirsty Ayatollahs. Mr. Liu's supporters have claimed that although flawed, we need an ambassador to Israel during this crisis. And Mr. Liu is the man in offering. But the fact is, no one is better than Jack Liu. And the sooner we defeat his nomination, the sooner we can find someone worthy of this critical post. I know my Democratic friends say we have to confirm Mr. Liu to show our support for Israel. I would turn that around and say we have to defeat Mr. Liu's nomination to show that our nation is finally serious about confronting the Ayatollahs in Iran. And there's no clearer or more immediate action that senators could take to show a new direction for U.S. policy on Iran than to reject the nomination of one of the architects of the Iran nuclear deal. Both the United States and Israel deserve a lot better than Jack Liu. I urge my colleagues to oppose his nomination.
Mr. President,
Senator from Idaho.
I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for up to 2 minutes and Senator Cardin be permitted to speak for up to 5 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise in opposition to this nomination, and I rise in support of our strong support for Israel. I understand it's important to move as quickly as we can to have an ambassador in Jerusalem. We are at an important moment in history with the events in Israel. This makes the stakes so much higher and important that we get it right. I believe it means we should take the time to get it right. This appointment that's been made is very disappointing. As my colleague just mentioned, it really ignores the fact that the underlying problem here is our policy and policies towards Iran. Certainly, we all talk about Hamas. They've done horrible things, the horrific attack on Israel where they beheaded babies and killed innocent men and women in their beds sometimes, really deserves a response. But it also deserves for us to look at the underlying problem here, which is Iran. Hamas would not exist if it was not for Iran. Iran arms them, trains them, finances them, and directs them. We all know that. So how does that fit in with this particular appointment? Well, Mr. Liu did some things which were very much contrary, I believe, to what needs to be done in order for us to redo our policies towards Iran. When it came to the JCPOA, which, as we all know, there was a difference between our side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle on whether we should do the JCPOA or not. Mr. Liu was heavily involved in that. He promised us in the committee that he would not allow Iran to have access to the U.S. financial system. We know for a fact that after that, although he denied it, he did in fact attempt his very best to have Iran have access to the U.S. financial system. This is borne out by an official report of the United States Senate by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. They interviewed the banks that Mr. Liu's attempts to twist their arms to give Iran access to the financial system. There was a very detailed investigation that was done on the fact. The facts are contained in this report. My good friends will say, oh, but that wasn't a bipartisan report. It is an official report by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. My friends on the other side of the aisle, though, will not deny the facts that are in this report. And the facts are that Mr. Liu was involved in this as I've described. I want to support Israel. I think everybody on this floor wants to support Israel. The last thing we need is somebody who is very contrary to our view on how Iran should be handled. Mr. Liu's response to this was, well, everybody knew what Obama's policies were, and therefore everybody should have known that we would do anything to blindly support the policies. That's wrong. This is the wrong way to go about it. This is the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong place. We should vote no and support Israel. Thank you, Mr.
President. Senator from Maryland. Mr. President, a little over a week ago, I was in Israel with 10 U.S. senators, meeting with the Israeli leadership. And I must tell you, they are very much looking forward to having a confirmed ambassador from the United States in Jerusalem to help in regards to the challenges they're now facing as a result of Hamas's terrorist attack in Israel. And they're very much looking forward to Jack Liu being that ambassador. We heard that directly. His nomination has been welcomed by the Israelis, including Israel's foreign minister, who said he looks forward to working with them. The former Israeli ambassador to the United States wrote that Liu is, quote, a true statesman and a passionate Jew, a mensch in every sense of the word. He has the support of the Jerusalem Post, the Orthodox Union Advocacy Center, the Anti-Defamation League, and the list goes on and on and on. Why? Because he is so well qualified for this position. He's been confirmed by the Senate as the former Secretary of Treasury, as a Deputy Secretary of State, as an OMB director, and the list goes on and on and on. Confirmed by overwhelming majorities. It gives us the person as our representative to Israel that has the gravitas to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel as the United States partners in the challenges that they're facing today. So there's, to me, no question about his qualifications, no question about his presence being welcomed by our Israeli friends, no question about his knowledge and commitment to these issues. He's worked his entire life part to strengthen the U.S.-Israel partnership. He knows the values. He testified to that during this confirmation hearing, and he testified in regards to the issues that my Republican friends are raising. The issues of whether he was forthright with Congress, and he was. He pointed out that in regards to opening up the banking for Iran, it was to comply with the JCPOA that was negotiated by the Obama administration, in which the Republicans were opposed to, and I opposed that agreement. I helped work with Senator Corker, then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I was a ranking Democrat at the time, to develop a process where we would not be surprised by these negotiations, that we would have input into these negotiations. That process passed the Senate by a near unanimous vote. As part of that process, we had in-depth discussions with the Obama administration, including Secretary Lew, including Secretary Moniz, and others who shared with us exactly what was being negotiated. We knew that there was going to be transfer of funds in regards to the JCPOA. We recognized that the banking system would be open for that limited purpose. That's not misleading us. That's telling us exactly what we knew was going to happen before we even took it up under the review statute. So it's just not right to say he misled us. He did not. And the report they're referring to was a partisan report issued by the Republicans. There's a reason why it was not bipartisan. They were just trying to double down on their opposition to the JCPOA. Israel needs a strong U.S. ambassador who will represent America and be their partner in taking on one of the greatest struggles in their history from the terrorist Hamas, what they did on October the 7th. We need a confirmed ambassador who's knowledgeable as how they can represent over 500,000 Americans that are currently in Israel. We need Jack Lew's expertise to help us get the hostages back safely on the ground in Israel. I want to thank Secretary Lew for being willing at this time, at this critical moment, to serve his country in this critically important position. And I would hope my colleagues would vote for his confirmation, recognizing that we could not have a more qualified individual to represent America as our ambassador to Israel. With that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Arkansas.
Last month, Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists slaughtered over 30 Americans and 1,400 Israelis. These depraved savages raped women, murdered children, and executed entire families, burning some of them alive. The dead are still being identified, and families are still grieving unbelievable heartbreak. Yet over the weekend, former President Barack Obama discovered complexity and ambiguity where there is none in these attacks. He said that we, quote, have to admit nobody's hands are clean, that all of us are complicit to some degree, end quote. What Barack Obama said over the weekend might pass for profound at cocktail parties on Martha's Vineyard or on podcasts with sycophantic former staffers, but is also delusional and morally obtuse. Put simply, it's a confession of a guilty man attempting to implicate others. Because we're not all complicit with Hamas's massacre of Jews, but Barack Obama sure is. No American president did more to embolden and enrich Iran and its terrorist proxies than Barack Obama. Indeed, his entire Middle East policy was crafted to appease Iran. As president, he stayed quiet when Iranian protesters took to the streets in the Green Revolution. He sabotaged legislation in Congress sanctioning Iran. He cut and ran from Iraq, knowing that Iran and its proxies would fill the power vacuum. He refused to enforce a self-drawn red line and stood by as Syria disintegrated into a geopolitical Chernobyl because Bashar al-Assad is an Iranian puppet. He consistently undermined Benjamin Netanyahu, Iran's chief nemesis in the region, and even refused to veto a United Nations Security Council resolution condemning Israel. And of course, he negotiated the disastrous Iran nuclear deal, handing the Ayatollahs over $100 billion in sanctions relief. Barack Obama single-handedly saved the Iranian economy and harmed diplomatic relations with our allies in Saudi Arabia and Israel. When he left office, the Middle East was in flames and Iran was on the march. Tragically, Barack Obama's coterie of Iran appeasers, apologists, and accomplices have returned to the White House. His understudy, Joe Biden, is now president. The man who helped to secretly negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, Jake Sullivan, is now National Security Advisor. And his Treasury Secretary, who served as a de facto investment banker for the Ayatollahs, is now ambassador to Israel. Barack Obama's legacy is alive and well in this administration, and it certainly shows. Within days of taking office, the Biden administration removed the Houthis, another Iranian proxy, from the list of terrorist organizations without any concessions. And how did the Houthis reward Joe Biden? By firing dozens of missiles and attack drones towards Israel just days after Hamas's rampage. In its first 100 days, the Biden administration announced that it would send hundreds of millions of dollars to Iran's friends in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. They claimed that it would foster peace and stability in the region. How did that work out? The next month, Iranian-backed militias launched 4,000 rockets into Israel. Since taking office, Joe Biden has enriched the Ayatollahs with over $90 billion through his lax enforcement of oil sanctions and his unfreezing of Iranian assets. Tehran has predictably used this Biden bonus to strengthen its military and arm its proxies. Just last year, Iran doubled the budget of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the shock troops of its terror regime, and it more than tripled its support for Hamas's military brigades. The very same month that Biden agreed to unfreeze $6 billion in Iranian assets, the Revolutionary Guard Corps reportedly started to assist with the planning of the October 7th attacks that killed, I say again, over 30 Americans and more than 1,400 Israelis. This is the nature of the regime that Barack Obama coddled for years. It is the nature of the regime that has dispatched its proxies to attack American service members over 110 times since Joe Biden took office. Let me say that again. Iran's proxies have attacked American troops and positions in the Middle East over 110 times since Joe Biden took office. And what has Joe Biden and his gang of Obama acolytes done in return? They fired a few missiles at empty proxy warehouses, merely validating Iran's proxy strategy. The Ayatollahs are laughing at Joe Biden just like they laughed at Barack Obama. Barack Obama is the last person who should pontificate on this issue. The only thing we should hear from him is an admission that he was wrong and an apology. Maybe he can include it in his upcoming fourth memoir due out later this year. My message to the former president is simple. Don't try to excuse your own failures by blaming the rest of us. The people complicit in the attack on Israel are the terrorists who committed it, the Iranian regime that funded it, and the Obama and Biden administrations that appeased them. The responsibility for the events of October 7th rests squarely on their shoulders and their shoulders alone. I yield the floor.
The senator from Arkansas.
Since Joe Biden took office, Iran and its proxies have attacked American troops in the Middle East at least 135 times. Let me say that again. 135 attacks on American troops since January 2021. What's worse is that 52 of those attacks have happened in the last month, since Hamas conducted its murderous rampage in its ongoing war against Israel. These rocket and drone attacks against American bases in Iraq and Syria have caused at least 56 service member injuries, 25 traumatic brain injuries, and 2 Americans have died because of these attacks. Just like they have been for years, these attacks are financed by Iran, Israel's greatest enemy. These attacks, let's be clear, are meant to kill Americans and to increase the conflict and the violence in the Middle East. So what's President Biden done in response to these attacks? Has he punished Iran and its proxies for killing Americans? Has he made it clear that the United States will not tolerate these attacks in the future? No, not even close. Consider, the Biden administration has also failed to enforce oil sanctions on Iran, giving them over $90 billion. And now President Biden is reportedly, once again, considering the release of the remaining $10 billion Iran is owed as part of his hostage exchange. What kind of message does it send to the people attacking our troops to give them another $10 billion more to fund their activities against the United States and Israel? In fact, since the terrible atrocity of October 7th, Joe Biden has not changed his Iran policy in a single way. Of the 135 attacks on Americans, the Biden administration has hit back fewer than 10 times. Think about that. 135 times they hit us, fewer than 10 times do we hit them back. When the attacks against Americans increased in October, President Biden didn't even authorize a response for 9 days. It took at least 13 attacks on Americans for President Biden to finally react. And what did he do? The bare minimum, striking empty weapons storage facilities in eastern Syria. After these strikes, Secretary Blinken said, "My warning to the Ayatollah was that if they continued to move against those troops, we will respond," and he should be prepared. Well, it's not surprising that shooting a bunch of empty warehouses doesn't scare Iran. In fact, it emboldened them in the form of 22 more attacks. That's right, proxies attacked American troops' positions 22 more times after that initial pathetic response. When Secretary Austin announced those strikes, he said, "The United States does not seek conflict and has no intention nor desire to engage in further hostilities." Well, Lloyd Austin and Joe Biden may not seek conflict, but Iran does. And it will continue to try to kill our troops until they face real consequences, until they are scared straight. On Sunday, we finally did hit back again, but again, we didn't even try to hold the real bad guys accountable. Instead, the administration once again shot only at expendable proxies. Iran obviously was not deterred by this latest pathetic response. How do we know that? Once again, these proxies have committed 4 more attacks against Americans since Sunday. Iran has had a proxy strategy for decades. It uses groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and militias in Iraq and Syria to deny responsibility for its campaign of terror against Israel and the United States. When we kill their proxies, all we do is validate their proxy strategy. Iran will fight to the last Arab, but Iran will not fight if we hold the things at risk that they hold most dear. Their shock troops in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, or, if necessary, sites and facilities in Iran itself. The United States needs Iran to know that we will not tolerate these attacks. We need to make sure Iran knows that we will not tolerate these attacks, and that any attacks by Iran's proxies will be treated as an attack by Iran on the United States and be met with devastating consequences. That's one reason I'll be introducing legislation later this week that would strengthen sanctions against the Iranian transfer of missiles and drone technologies to terrorists and even other nations like Russia, which uses them in its war against Ukraine. We'll also stop Iran from developing the kind of long-range missiles that can threaten the United States homeland. Because again, If we let Iran continue to shoot at American troops in the Middle East without shooting back at the Iranians who are directing those attacks, what will they do if they get their hands on missiles that can target America? What will they do if they get their hands on a nuclear weapon? It is time today to make Iran once again fear the United States before more Americans die. Mr. President, you have the floor.